Welcome to Peace, Love, and Pollinators, the podcast that's anything but your typical gardening show. We're here to transform how you see your backyard, balcony, or local park by uncovering the powerful connections between you, your plants, and the planet. From pollinator-friendly gardening hacks to creating green spaces that fight climate change, we explore more than just what to plant. We dig into why it matters. You are listening to Peace, Love, and Pollinators. All right, welcome to Peace, Love, and Pollinators. Our guest today is Cheryl Salatino. Cheryl is a New England-based landscape designer, educator, native plant enthusiast. A bit more than 20 years ago, she started Dancing Shadow Garden Design to offer clients a more thoughtful and purposeful design aesthetic. What continues to inspire this designer is how the beauty and value of nature endlessly challenges us, surprises us, and teaches us. You can also find Cheryl in the classroom, working on programs from the Native Plant Trust, Coastal Maine Botanic Gardens, Tower Hill Botanic Gardens, Southern Maine Community College, and various garden clubs across Massachusetts. Cheryl is well-credentialed, holding certificates of landscape design from Harvard University. She's a Mass-certified horticulturist and has advanced certificates in native plant studies from both the Native Plant Trust and Green School UMass. Welcome, Cheryl. I'm very excited to have you on today.
Thanks, Trevor. It's a pleasure.
This is awesome. So this episode today, we are going to all be kind of talking about how to create pollinator-friendly landscapes. So everybody wants their pollinators. Everybody wants to know how to attract them. But most people figure they're attracting their pollinators just by putting flowers in their yard and having, some sort of blooms, whether they be annual, whether they be perennial. People just think flowers, so they could be ornamentals as well. So we'd like to kind of dig into what does it really take to create a pollinator-friendly landscape. So what I'd like to ask people first, always, is where did your love for nature begin, and what made you choose this career? Because it is certainly a unique career path, and what I love is everybody has a different path that got us here. So what got you into nature, and what made you choose this as your career?
Well, Trevor, it's a funny thing about gardens. It doesn't always start right away. And for me, when I was a kid, my grandfather, who was a gardener, that was his job. He was a gardener, and he managed an estate for a doctor. Now, I never went on that estate, but I went in his backyard, and his backyard was full of edibles and interesting fruiting trees. So how did I ever eat a fig? Why would I ever have one of those? Because my grandfather had figs in the garden.
Excellent.
So,
dragging him in and out of the garage every year.
So I learned this in the gene pool, I think.
Excellent.
And then I didn't start my career in horticulture. I started my career in business. So I had a slow move towards horticulture. And it really sparked itself when I bought a house. And I looked at my landscape and said, well, there's not a whole lot of here but a lawn, but what do I do with that? And I learned you got to study it before you start digging and learn about this land. And I hated mowing the lawn. Oh my God, it was horrible. I was like, I got to get rid of this as much as possible. So it took me a little while to kind of get my education, but I started with hating the lawn and jumping into educational opportunities.
Excellent. Excellent. Yes, I totally feel you. I think, similar. I grew up with my grandmother, out in nature. She was a member of the garden club, so I'd go down into her basement, after school and build wreaths and dried arrangements with all the ladies from the garden club. So it is kind of like that in the gene pool. It's at that young age that, you get, brought into this world, and then it never really leaves you. So I can totally understand how you went into business for a while, but then felt that pull back to nature. So beyond all this design work that you do, you also lead garden tours and speak to groups and the like. So what is it about sharing your knowledge that you like the most? Because this is definitely something that we have in common. So what really drives you? You have so many educational entities that you work with, and you're just involved with so much more than just doing the designs themselves. So what is it about education that drives you?
It's addictive to get people interested in something they don't really know that they love quite yet. Giving them the perspective to see differently, appreciate things, or look at something from a different perspective. It opens people's eyes, and all of a sudden you see the light bulbs go off, and they start asking questions, and they get fascinated by small things that you can share. I often have to say to people, look, tell me if I'm overwhelming you with information because I want you to love this. I don't want to pull it away from you because it's overwhelming to your brain at this time or any time. So let's go down and discover it.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that discovery, we always think discovery is kind of like a childlike quality, but it happens with all of us.
Facts.
There's so much fun in discovery, something new, something different, a unique way of looking at something. And then people then take it into themselves and translate that however they want. So the fun of it is opening up eyes, opening up minds, and opening up curiosity.
Absolutely. I actually just used the light bulb image in a conversation the other day where I was saying my favorite part, somebody asked me the same question. And I said my favorite part about speaking is looking out into the audience and seeing the light bulbs go off, seeing people make connections like all of a sudden just because you phrase something differently. And it's true. I think as designers and educators, it is most important because gardening seems big and gardening seems difficult and unknown. And it seems like a gamble because you're putting your money out there. And I think getting people to understand that it's a learning process and that's the fun in it. And it's experimenting. It's trying to grow something somewhere. It's not really growing, thriving, so you move it somewhere else. And usually when I speak to garden clubs or other people, I said, you guys are lucky because you're all gardeners. That means like you can take your plants, divide them all over your yard, move things around. If it doesn't necessarily do well, you just kind of shift it and do it like that. I said, the difference between that and landscape designers is we pretty much have to get it right the first time. I said, so there's a little more pressure on us to nab it. But again, with education, I'm 100% with you. And just watching those light bulbs go off, watching people make those connections, get excited about going out and trying new things and feeling comfortable, out there in the landscape and in their garden and looking at it as a place to connect and a place to experiment. And like you said, the curiosity is everything.
Absolutely. And what's really funny is people, of course, you're in the outside doing things and they'll start asking you other questions. And the other questions will be things around, well, I'm a black thumb, and I have to stop them. And I have to say, you are not a black thumb. There is no such thing.
No such thing.
The only reason why you think you're a black thumb is because you love your plants too much.
Yep. Absolutely. And if you keep telling yourself you're a black thumb, you'll become a black thumb. You have to manifest the green thumb mentality.
And if you realize what you're doing, what your practices are. I want my plants to succeed so much that I give them lots of water and yet they don't need that, or lots of sun and yet they're burning. It's because you love them too much. So take a step back and decide, maybe it's me and not me killing the plant.
Right, exactly. Yes, you are loving it too much. I mean, I say to people, you set the stage and then get out of the way.
Yeah,
absolutely. It really is. Plants, I relate plants and people quite often. So it really is like children. It's just like you set that foundation and then they have to go off and live their life. I say to people all the time, I was like, if you keep watering, if you keep fertilizing, you're going to have a 30-something-year-old that won't leave the basement and it's just, down there playing video games and eating pizza. I said, you have to teach them to be out on their own eventually. So
absolutely,
that's definitely what it's all about. So, I mean, today we're definitely coming down, like, I want to talk because all the interest, especially in, I'd say, the past 3 years, like, I mean, maybe a little bit longer, but the past 3 years, like the majority of requests when I go out to somebody's landscape is, they're always like, well, low maintenance, of course, but there are a lot more requests on, I'd like plants from around here, native plants or plants that are from around here. And then usually somebody's either asking for birds or for pollinators or for a little bit of both. So how did you become interested in the plight of our native pollinators? Because, I mean, I say to people all the time, a honeybee does not a pollinator garden make. So we have all these native bees, native pollinators that people see but don't see. Like they're just bugs in the garden. So, what kind of got your interest into the native pollinators and, really what makes that plight and protecting our pollinators or landscaping for our pollinators so important?
I think the interesting thing was, as a landscaper, if you will, someone being in the landscape, there was a little bit of concern that you didn't see a lot of buzzing going around. Where are the bees? Where are the bugs? Where are the wasps? Where's everybody? And in some cases, where are the birds?
Mm-hmm.
And we're like, something is wrong. And that's when other scientists started talking about what is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The other piece that was, and still is, very troubling to me is the use of pesticides in our home landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
People go to Home Depot, as an example, and buy these things that kill everything, good and bad. And they don't even know what good and bad is, because often a bug is bad. And so for me, I had to start to think about, how do I frame this for myself and for others to understand that when you see bugs in the landscape, you're doing a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're not seeing bugs in the landscape, your landscape possibly will start to collapse. And so for me, it was very important to start to understand communicating of some very basic scientific knowledge without getting too technical about it, and understanding that we have been manifesting our home properties into a barren landscape full of lawn and chemicals. And we're doing this. We are choosing to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to change it up. And I'm not a turf girl, I'll call it. I'm not a turf girl.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, I already told you I don't like mowing. So I wanted to change it up so people got diversity in their garden, and not real issues with having nothing growing, changing. You have to see difference. So the pollinators were interesting to start to uncover, okay, who are these pollinators and when might they come out, and make it a little bit of a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I got to it, and still come to it when people start to talk about pollinators, because often they talk about just bees.
Yes.
And it's way more than that.
Yeah, or they just want butterflies. I've been requested before. Somebody said, I want to have a butterfly garden, no bees. And I'm like, you don't get to choose. You certainly don't get to choose. But yes, totally agree. And, it's a huge between lawns and turf. And I think between how our gardens are managed and look, I think teaching people, it's the paradigm shift. It's teaching people that, clovers and violet in your lawn, not the end of the world. You're still a good person if that happens. And I think teaching people that if nothing is eating your garden, you're doing it wrong. And I think, people will see beetles without identifying them, maybe on their plant, or maybe they have like the Japanese beetle in their garden. So they grab one of these sides like you're talking about, and they just wipe everything out, but they're so focused on that one thing. I try to get people, I've been working on it for quite some time now. It's not easy to do, is trying to take pest out of my vernacular, because it's just like everybody has a right to eat. It doesn't matter who, it could be a grub in your lawn. Everybody has a right to eat. So, this mass killing, I think needs to be replaced with restoring balance. Now, sometimes our gardens get out of balance, and sometimes we need to do things to kind of give the plants enough of a reprieve so their own immune system can kick in. But going in and wiping stuff out, like you said, is just not the way to go. And the repercussions of pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, is a lot deeper, especially with our pollinators. It goes a lot deeper than we think. So why I had you on is because you were, a participating member, a big player when it came to writing the Native Plant Trust Pollinator Manual, which you can find on the Native Plant Trust website. And I just want to talk, before we kind of get into what the manual was all about, I just want to know if you can kind of talk us through the process in developing the guide. Like, what did you think about, and how did you, because it's an excellent guide, what were you trying to accomplish in doing that? And then what were the challenges in taking all of that, maybe all of that information, and breaking it down? What were some of the challenges that you faced in creating this manual? Because it's excellent.
Well, the manual was an opportunity to get people who were thinking about it, didn't really understand how to build a garden or how to build a pollinator garden. It seemed like it's too many steps. It's too hard. I need all this information. I have to hire somebody. And our goal was, how do we get average, normal homeowners to take a step, a small step? Even if it's a small little pollinator garden in the sun, can we get them to take action? So when I look at anything, I try to figure out what's the purpose? And how do I take a position on this? And I really felt the purpose was to make activity happen, because it was still kind of early when we were writing this. Pollinators were being talked about, but there wasn't a lot of resource material that was available, at least not without reading, 150 pages.
Yes.
So my feeling was, okay, well, how can I make this a little bit different? So the first thing I do is I take the pollinator's position. I'm like, all right, I'm the pollinator, and what is the message I need to get out to people? All right. And so I put my bee hat on, or my butterfly hat on. And I said, I want to talk to people and say, here's what I need. This is what I need you to do. And these are the steps I need you to take. And by the way, I need you to go all the way through this from beginning to end, all year round. I need you to know what to do, because I'm sharing your property. Thank you for inviting me. I'm your guest, and I want you to be a good host, and I want to tell you my needs. So that's where I started.
That's excellent.
You have to make it fun, right?
It is fun. Totally. All right. We're like, so the challenge, I guess, was trying to like break down all of that information. And you did an excellent job, and we'll just, we can just kind of jump right into that, because, you divvied up this manual into 5 steps. And this was the first thing when I opened it, I'm like, how was this even done in 5 steps? Because it's just like, my brain keeps going, and thinking like a pollinator. I'm like, well, I want this and I want this. And next thing I know, I'm like a rock star coming with a rider. It's just like, I want this and I want this, and you have to have this ready for me at this time. So let's just kind of go through, we could just go through those 5 steps, and you could just, let me know maybe a couple bullet points about each step that somebody listening could just be like, oh, all right, like this is where to, this is what to focus on. This is the most important things in the chapter. So like with collecting data is where we'll start. That's the first step. What are the most important data points that you need to collect to create a successful garden, to create a successful pollinator garden? What are we looking at? Because we haven't even gotten into plants. Now we're collecting data. Like that could blow some people's minds, because you're just like, what data do I need? I just want to plant a garden. So what kind of data should we be collecting?
In general, it's very important to know your property. And just the way that I start collecting data and ask people to collect data is walk your property. Look around. What do you have? And by the way, what's successful in your mind? What's okay and happy? Generally, as we know about collecting data, there's some basics. You need to know, how much sun do you have? Most of the time, you're not home. You have no clue. You're like, well, I think I have full sun here.
Everybody says they have full sun.
Everybody does, and they don't. So I often say, you got to do a little studying. You might want to take some pictures. You might want to get yourself a little measurement tool. You might want to just get out there on the weekend at different times of the day, because the sun changes during the day, and you want to know where your opportunity is. Getting exposure, and exposure is important in 2 ways. It's how much sun, but also how much heat do you have? Because plants don't always like heat and fade fast. So you want to just understand the condition. What am I putting them through? Those poor things that are going to be blooming and making me happy. The next thing you want to know is, okay, what is my soil made up of? Dig my soil up and put it through my fingers. What do I feel? Is it really sticking very much? Is it very sandy? Is it very clay-like? Or is it what we all covet, a bit in between both? A nice loam. Well, none of us have that. But plants can live in anything. We have plants specific to any type of conditions. So if you know your conditions, you can choose the right plants. So if you don't want to be that person who has a garden that fails, all you have to do is get a few pieces of information. Why do we care about the soil? We care about the soil because we need to know how much water is available and how much water is naturally available. Because guess what? Water is a resource that is becoming more and more of a concern for us. And so we've got to live with what's available. So understanding what I call the big 3. The big 3 are the sun exposure, your soil, and your water availability. And when you need to go deeper on that, we do as landscape designers. But the average homeowner, if you get those 3 basics and really understand that water availability, you will be able to start to put the right plants in the right place.
Absolutely, which is the total key. And people, I find, especially having started at Weston, and working with many retail customers and even working with landscapers. They think right plant, right place. You put a shade plant in the shade and a sun plant in the sun, and it's certainly not like that at all. And like you said, if we can create drought resistant or climate resilient or, landscapes, that's exactly, where we want to be going. So I totally agree. And we'll get into this in a little bit, but one of the things that's great about natives is that they love our crappy soil, or they love the soil wherever they're native to, wherever you might be in the country. Your native plants love your soil. So like you said, there are native plants that will grow in gravel, and there are native plants that will grow in deep, dry shade. And they just love that acidic soil of the Northeast, and they just love our crappy New England soils. So it's just, they are lower maintenance in that you don't have to create, hyper environments or take heroic measures to get them established in your soil.
Absolutely agree with you, because one thing that is often a challenge is people think that you have to give native plants or all plants rich soils, and that's not the truth.
No, you can kill them that way.
These plants are smart. They've evolved over years and years and years, and they've figured out, all right, what do you got? All right, can I live with that? All right, I'm not loving it, but I'm going to move over here until they get what they want. So they've figured it out. Trust those darn plants to do their job.
Mm-hmm. If you're looking to bring a little more green into your life, you have to check out Weston Nurseries, New England's go-to destination for all things outdoor living. Plants, trees, garden essentials, and garden inspiration. For over 100 years, Weston Nurseries has been helping gardeners, beginners and experts alike, creating stunning outdoor spaces. Plus, they offer workshops, events, and expert consultations from yours truly to make sure you have everything you need to grow with confidence. Visit them at their locations in Hopkinton, Chelmsford, Hingham, and now in Lincoln, Mass. Or shop online at westernurseries.com. Doing a little research, but I don't think you have to do tons and tons of research, which gets us into our next point, making a plan. Why is making a plan important, and what are the steps involved or important things to think about?
Often people who are thinking about gardens really love plants. They want everything.
Yes,
right?
totally.
I want everything. And what I like to do is first make a wish list. I would love all these things. And then just categorize them a little bit. What do they need? Just understand, put them in this category. They like a drier environment. These guys like a wetter. This one's a sunny one. And those symbols are often you're able to find those when you're looking up a plant. And if you're looking for natives, Native Plant Trust has a plant finder that, you can dive into that. They have Go Botany. I mean, there's resources, and there's all kinds of web resources from all of the extensions that are state-based. So we have data. It gets to be too much, though. So that's why I say, make your wish list. And then from there, decide, all right, let me create a little bit of a community together. Who might like each other as friends? But the key to making a plan is not just who likes each other, because yes, we are creating a community of plants that will work together, but it's also what's your bloom time? Because pollinators very, very, very much want to spend some time in your garden, and not just summer. I'm visiting you for the summer. I'm going to visit somebody else for, the fall. No, they're used to you, and they don't like to travel too far. They're your guests. And you, by the way, as the owner of the garden, want all-season bloom or all-season interest. So it's very important to make a plan, because you have the opportunity, instead of putting everything in the ground and figuring out it didn't work, you do it on a piece of paper at your kitchen table. It's a lot less resources, time, energy, money, effort to get it right. So yeah, a plan means just a little organization. Let's organize it. Let's fix it. And it's not going to be perfect. Understand that there's no perfect. The plants will figure it out. They'll move around and kind of circle around each other. But a plan also allows you not to be, what I'm going to say, doing plunkitis. You plunk one here, you plunk one there, and they may or may not look like anything. Allows you to group them together in little vignettes, if you will, either 3s or 5s or something, so that when you're looking at the garden, you actually see something.
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that you mentioned, which is very important, that I'm sure we both teach in our design classes, is repetition. We evolved as a species to identify patterns in the landscape. So if I walk into your property and I am looking at the left side of your garden and say I find echinacea there, instantly, without even knowing it, my eye is scanning to see if I can find that same flower or a similar shape. Like, I really like that you talked about put it all down and then throw it out, because that's exactly the way I design. I go in, I get all hyped up, I'll wind up with, 60 some odd plants, and I'm like, okay, now I got to start weeding this out. But it's a lot easier to do it that way, because then you can pick and choose, like you said, with bloom time. You can pick and choose with, heights. You might be like, wow, I got so many tall plants, like I got to throw some of those out, but now I've eliminated my late season bloomers, like my goldenrod and asters. And if you do have a client that wants a pollinator garden but does take off for the majority of summer, you still need to have that representation, and you still need to explain to them, look, I'm going to make this absolutely beautiful for when you're here, but the purpose of this garden is not just you. So we need to make sure that something's going on in the spring, even though you're not back from vacation or Florida yet. We need to make sure that something's happening here, so that we have it going straight across the board. I think that's excellent, and I love to pick it out and throw it out.
I think it's really key to let people know that the pollinators are kind of taking care of things while you're away.
Yep, totally. Absolutely.
And the other thing that folks don't really think about first when they're putting a pollinator garden together and planning is that it's not just flowers. We need some other stuff in here. And so why do we put things like grasses and things? Who needs that? Well, I think about them in two ways. One, clearly nesting opportunities, those kinds of things. But they also hold up these guys. These are the guys that prop up everybody to stay upright, that they have a little support. So I like to think in terms of stature, and everybody is a group of friends. They're helping each other out in various stages of growth, and they're allowing less work for us to be staking things, and when the other types of plants can help.
Yes, totally.
Putting that plan together and saying, oh, that might actually work together is kind of fun too.
Yeah, it's absolutely. It can be daunting, but I think the way you've broken it down in the manual and the way you just broke it down, makes it a fun Saturday morning, exercise. You can go on to I am a regular on the Native Plant Trust Plant Finder website, and then I usually go from there to the Weston website and use their plant library just to build a wish list so that I can see it all in front of me, and then I start eliminating all those other plants from there. So I think using those online tools it's great. And yeah, the plant finder, I'm probably on that almost every day.
One of the things that is important also in planning is color, because pollinators, many of them, are attracted to color. They see stuff that we don't see. They're, especially bees, butterflies, they're looking at plants differently, and they're looking for their nectar sources, and they can see via UV light. We can't see that. And it's fascinating to see what a bee sees versus what we see.
Totally.
However, bright colors and certain colors are attractive and will bring them into the garden and keep them there. And knowing what those colors are is important. So that can be a fun part too, to keep us away from just, this color or kind of too many purples or too many yellows or too many of this or that. The colors that we love, the pollinators love too.
Absolutely. I mean, if you were designing, I guess, for specific pollinators, like let's just say you are trying to attract hummingbirds and butterflies, then hanging in those orange, reds, and yellows, works. But other butterflies are really going to hang with the whites and purples. And then the bees, it's a whole other different ballgame. So it's, it's looking at those pollinator syndrome charts, like what everybody is attracted to.
Yes.
Easy to find online. Absolutely doing that.
I often talk about the pollinator syndrome because it's just eye-opening when you look at it. And then it also opens up your mind to these other pollinators that I never think of as pollinators. They have some requirements too. And it gets you to kind of open up your, I'd say, interest in having more pollinators than just a few pollinators.
It also I think it adds depth to the to the pollinator, because otherwise it's like, okay, yeah, there's a bunch of bees, but once you realize that those bees have tastes just like we have tastes, and once you learn those, like, oh wow, this bee has a favorite color, oh, this bee has a favorite flower shape, well, I have a favorite color and flower shape, it's just like you start making those similarities, and now you've just opened up so much more depth. There's so much more than just little bugs in the garden.
Yes, agree.
Buzzing
totally
about.
Agree.
All right, so now that we have our plan and everything, how do we go about, really prepping the bed? And this is a question I get all the time, because there's a number of good ways to go about it. You mentioned solarizing, you mentioned smothering and mechanical methods of doing this. We'll just start with those because there are pros and cons to each. So can you walk us through what is solarization? You have to choose the right method.
Again, you really have to know your property and your neighbors, because neighbors are also experiencing your property in views from theirs. And if you are trying not to offend people, but get them excited about pollinators and gardens, you don't want them complaining. Now, when we think of prepping a bed, we also think about, where is it? Is it in the front yard? Is that going to be a problem? Some towns even have issues around creating, meadow-style gardens in the front lawn because they want it neat. And we can address those kinds of things to make them neat. But it's the prep stage that usually gets people up in arms. Because when you're solarizing, it means you're taking, I'll call it plastic sheeting, something that can bake what's underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And I find solarization is quicker if you've got a full sun situation and you're baking out a lawn. That's going to go much faster than some other methods, not all methods, but some other methods. So I find solarization can be really beneficial if you truly are going to burn it out, and then can use that burned material as sort of compost, if you will.
Yeah.
The bad part about solarization, of course, is you got to keep it pinned down, and you want to keep rodents and things out of the area, and you want it hot. You want to make sure it's hot. So you just have to pay attention to maintain that a little bit so that it does the job for you.
Let's just say I'm trying to reduce the size of my front yard. To have plastic pulled over my yard for a little bit is going to raise some eyebrows.
And I would like to say it's an approach for a bigger area, or an area that you feel like you can't manage it on your own. You need, by digging it, you can't really just do it with the work that it requires. So it's a method.
You are not just, say, killing the lawn or whatever is beneath the plastic, but you're also eliminating the seed bank, because it gets so hot under there. Any weed seeds that are laying dormant waiting to germinate, when you cook it like that, you really are kind of neutralizing or sterilizing the area, getting it ready for your garden. Benefit to that is you're not disturbing the soil. Kind of the con to that is much of the soil life that can move will move out during the solarization process. However, they can move back in. The city is intact. They just have to leave temporarily.
That's right.
And then they can move back in once the temperatures kind of get back to normal. So tell us about smothering methods, and when would you use that, and what are the pros and cons to that?
Well, if you feel that your soil needs improvement, and it's not like a lot going on there, then you may want to smother it or sheet mulch it. And that takes time. And that's not a 6-month effort. This could be a year or more to get layers of cardboard and, I'll call it, mulch material, soil on top of it, and break all that down. But ultimately, the best way to improve your soil in that area, and also smother out most of the problematic pieces, you're going to be doing it over time, and it's time and patience that you really need. Now, it's not as nasty looking, because the top layer is just going to look like dirt, if you will, or mulch. So nobody's going to say to you, well, that's horrible. They might say, why aren't you planting it? You'll be able to say, I will be.
Yep.
But it's time consuming, and it's several layers. I mean, we're not talking about 3 layers. We're talking about several layers. And that depends a little bit by each garden. So you have to figure out a bit about your property. The hard part is it's not going to heat up the same way. It's
No.
not going to be quick the same way. You're really talking about decomposition.
Mm-hmm.
And decomposition takes time. Yet the real benefit is the organic matter in the soil if you've got a very weak soil. Now, do you have to do that for natives? Not necessarily. But you do have to understand about what is the soil that I have, because ultimately that all will bake into what you've got. It's not going to stay just where it is. It's a good thing to do, but you're going to get more, I'd say, longer term benefit from it as it spreads itself out.
Yes, it is. It definitely is a longer term approach. And, you know, you might get a few raised eyebrows as you're spreading Amazon boxes all over the front of your yard. But it involves, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's going to involve layering 2-3 layers of cardboard. Then you're going to put the mulch on top. You're going to water that whole thing in, let it begin to rot. Now, almost every soil could benefit from a little boost in organic matter. You know, it helps.
Absolutely.
It helps drive the soil life. It helps drive the water holding capacity. All those things that you talked about, except for the sun, up in that data collection. The two other points, you know, the hydrology and the soil. You're building that soil microbiome, and you're increasing the hydrology of the soil by adding that organic matter, which is creating a climate resistant or resilient landscape. So that's absolutely key. Now, mechanical methods. What would mechanical methods entail?
Before we move to mechanical, let's talk a little bit more about sheet mulching, because to build that soil, really important stuff you've got on your site already. You've already got leaf litter. You've got stuff that you can use to break down naturally. And so you're using materials, and we like to say reusing materials, these. And so you're not necessarily buying lots of additional things to throw in here. You're really using what you have, Mother Nature gave you, and you're letting it break down. And it's really doing exactly what you're saying about breaking that down and improving soils over time, because it does, the organic matter is going to help that hydrology, and we need that more and more today. I think that when I do it, 3 layers is even not enough. I mean, usually we're doing 3 to 5 layers of this stuff, and that's why it takes so long. It's not a short term or, you know, kind of a easy way to go. But those people who are committed gardeners understand that this is such a value in their environment, and they'll put the time and energy in.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely. And you can mask that. Remember that, you know, you could put temporary plants around something like that. Nobody would even see it.
Yeah, on the other end of all that, once we've done those layers, once we've done the smothering, let's just say we did that, you know, this spring. Now it's next spring, 26. Do I have to dig all that stuff up to then plant into it, or
no? Because you're going to put your shovel in, and you're going to find out pretty quickly it's all gone. How did that happen? And that happened, and you may have to keep an eye on that through the processes and make sure that it's moist enough and the rot is happening, you know, its breakdown is happening. So if it's going to be really droughty, it's going to be a challenge for that to break down in the time that it should. So there is a little maintenance on this as well, and hopefully not too wasteful, but yet certainly Mother Nature giving us a little bit more rain in the time frame. It was great, and snow is fabulous.
Yes, absolutely. And I think here again, similar to solarization, we're going to be smothering the seed bank. So we are kind of holding down, not completely eliminating, but holding down many of the seeds that we don't want to see, because they're going to be underneath all of this material. And unlike the solarization, where that can kind of be a little bit detrimental to the immediate soil family and soil life, this is building it from the start.
That's right.
So the trade-off here, though, is time. This takes a lot more time to decompose and be your site ready. Although that gives you more time to plan your beds.
That's right. Absolutely. Because you could dream. You know, one of our challenges about people understanding the seed bank is that, you know, we don't really think about it. We're growing lawn or other things. And yet, if you have a disturbance, like all of a sudden a tree comes down in a windstorm, that a shady place turns into a sunny place, and we start seeing what volunteers. That's really important data. If you have that situation, knowing what you're up against can also help you choose a way to make the environment different. A solarization versus putting the more time into the sheet mulching.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're dealing with any sort of overly aggressive ornamental or an invasive species. For instance, I had a client take down a bunch of pine trees. Instantly, within months of those pine trees coming down, little bittersweet started popping up everywhere. Now, that was nothing happening in those pine trees before I went there, before they went down. Nothing was under there. Took just a couple months, and now all those bittersweet seeds are starting to grow. Rather than trying to go through and continually weed all of them, if you solarize that area, you just cook all of that out and be able to start again. Whereas if you chose smothering for that area, something like an invasive might start pushing its way up through, but something like turf grass, certainly not a problem.
Yeah.
So the third one is mechanical. If you want to just walk us through mechanical.
And mechanical is kind of funny. I find it for me, a little disturbing to see people, doing sod cutters and things like that, renting those. But ultimately, the way that I look at it is you're stripping and not digging. So how can you strip the top layer? So now you're taking the lawn off almost like you're cutting it. And we can do that with something mechanical or something less mechanical, like a garden tool.
Mm-hmm.
I like to think of it more as like you're stripping the top planted layer off.
Yep.
Now you're not
leaving the roots.
You're leaving the roots. And therefore, you have to decide at that point, okay, now I haven't disturbed the soil. So the seed bank isn't necessarily going to pop, except now it's exposed and there may be more sun and all the rest of it. However, if you're planting a woody bed, you may be able to get away with doing that stripping approach more quickly because you're only digging the holes that you need. You're not disturbing the whole area. Mm-hmm. And the less disturbance that we can make is the most important thing to remember.
Yes. So, I totally agree with that. So oftentimes the mechanical method, from what I've seen, are for people who don't have the patience either to wait for smothering, for people who can't stand the temporary aesthetic of solarization. So, this is a realm that I certainly work in a lot. And the key is to not set the sod cutter down so you're taking up the first 1.5 inches, 2 inches. You really want to put it on its lower level. So all you're doing is just scalping or cutting the crowns off the plants, leaving those roots. By leaving that soil community intact, your new garden is going to take so much quicker rather than if you tilled it. I always liken tilling to like an earthquake within a city. So if you picture the soil microbiome as a city of, networks and friends and utility lines running everywhere, and then there's an earthquake and that all gets turned upside down, you then have to put it back together before it starts functioning again. The less you disturb the soil, the more of the city you're really preserving, and it takes no time after you've just dug that little hole within the system, to kind of fix things and go back together again.
I really find that when you don't disturb, your new plants are going to crowd out the bad ones or the ones you don't want. And they'll take advantage of some of that organic matter that is starting to break down from them because they can't get the sun that they need, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I find that sometimes we have to kind of let the lawn kind of hang out and die on its own by crowding it and shading it out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of I'll say a hybrid method of doing it where you don't have to clear everything, because I'm working a lot in woody plants. Mm-hmm. And I don't need all that right away. Sometimes I can use that, I'll say that clipped lawn layer to be my mulch for a little while, as long as I don't really let it grow. And so I'm shading out my problems instead of trying to do some of the other methods. So there's always hybrids in these situations, knowing what you are putting in first. That's why the plan is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, mechanical being till, because a lot of people think they need to till for a new bed, understanding that you're ruining the soil microbiome. But a time that you would do that is, let's just say, like sometimes I'll go to somebody's house and they will have put an addition on. Well, for that addition, then they had an excavator there. They dug up all of the subsoil. So we have like all of this life. We have dirt up top. There's no longer soil. We have dirt and it's all compacted. So like when you're in a situation like that with like lifeless compacted soils, then sure, till in 2-3 inches of compost or whatever to then get your garden going. But as a practice, tilling shouldn't be used, I would say, in garden bed creation. This episode is brought to you by Weston Wholesale, the go-to destination for landscapers and designers who want top quality plants, unbeatable service, and prices that make sense for their bottom line. If you're in the business of creating stunning landscapes, you need a supplier who understands your needs. At Weston Wholesale, we don't just sell plants. We partner with you to ensure your projects thrive. With a massive selection of trees, shrubs, and perennials, plus bulk soil, mulch, and hardscape essentials, we've got everything you need to bring your client's vision to life. Stop by our locations in Hopkinton, Chelmsford, Middleborough, and our newest location in Lincoln, Mass. to see why pros across New England trust Weston Wholesale. Learn more and apply at westonwholesale.com. The other default that people go to is, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in the beginning, people get excited and they want to make sure that their garden has the best start ever. So they walk into the garden center and they see all these beautiful bags with all these wonderful promises on them. And they're just like, this is going to make my garden, my meadow, anything incredible. So like, what is it about people and fertilizer? And do we really need, to go and add all of these extra amendments to our soil to get our garden going? Is it really needed? Is fertilizer needed within our garden?
I liken this to spoiling the child. You're going to put fertilizer into your garden to get them started. And essentially what those plants are going to do is stay right where that fertilizer is. Mm-hmm. Why should I even go into that other area and spread? It's not nice. Yep. I want to be spoiled.
Yep.
And so you actually limit your ability for your garden to take advantage of what it can grow in. You've spoiled it, enriched it, and it starts to wither because it can't, won't spread.
Mm-hmm.
So fertilizer used to be the thing that everybody recommended. Oh, yes, we always have to add amendments in. And if you look at the old garden books, they're going to tell you to do that. And we're here to say, you've got to put the plant in the right place. The plant wants certain conditions, by the way, that you have. Mm-hmm. And if you match it up, don't muck it up by putting something else in that they don't want.
Exactly.
So leave those fertilizers behind. That's a marketing thing. Someone wants to sell you something, believe it.
Yep. Use your money for plants. Now, what should people be using instead of, say, fertilizer? Like what is the alternative that people should be adding?
Well, what we're trying to do is make sure that our soils are able to hold some moisture. At least if you're using plants that are kind of native to New England, they want some consistency of moisture, not wet, not completely drought dry, unless you design the garden for that purpose. Mm-hmm. But most of our gardens want a little moisture. So we have the raw materials. We have our leaf litter. We have our compost areas. We have our cuttings from during the season, after the season. We've got a lot of material that we can just put in a bin, compost it, heat it up, let it do its decomposing, and then use that to amend our soils or use it as mulches. Mm-hmm. So we're using natural materials that are already available to us to improve the soil with organic matter. That's all we're trying to do. So just use what you have.
Because the soil knows how to digest that organic matter, and the soil doesn't necessarily know how to digest, say, a synthetic fertilizer.
That's right. There's billions of microbes underneath the ground. We've never seen them. You can't find them. You don't know what they are. But guess what? They're working for you. Mm-hmm. And you do not want to push them away. Allow them to do their job. Now, when we put a lot of additional organic matter in, say we put leaves without really chewing them up enough, or we just integrate all this stuff. Now, the microbes won't be doing everything they need to be doing in the soil to improve it, but they'll be focused on breaking that material down. Mm-hmm. And then they'll go back to doing the regular job. So if you can break it down a little bit, it's going to help your soil improve faster.
Yes.
So important to constantly think about improving your soil with organic matter than adding something that is artificial to it.
Now, speaking of organic matter, and I'm wondering if you can just echo me on this, and because the very common garden bed practice is to add peat moss. And it is still a common practice that people think, oh, I'm building a garden bed. I need to buy a big bale of peat moss because that's what my grandfather did. That's what that's how you start this bed. Can you tell us why that probably isn't the kind of organic matter we want to be looking for?
I think we have to understand a little bit about what peat is all about. It's made for a totally different environment. It's not made for outdoor gardening, the way we do it. What we're looking at when we get peat is something that's going to retain water or pull water away from something else. So it's going to be, I say, it's going to be greedy. It's going to take all your resources away and not distribute them out. So a lot of times people will say, integrate peat moss in, and that's going to hold your moisture. Forget that story. Get rid of the peat moss. Get your leaves, cut them up, put the normal stuff in, the things that our soils are used to receiving, because they're going to create the microfiber fungi that we need.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to get the chemical reactions going based on the natural materials available that have been breaking down in the forest for years and years and years.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't need to add something from another type of environment to our garden bed. It's not going to help us. It's really not the kind of mix we want to be creating. So these are not natural soils. There's not what I would say a lot of nutrients they're going to be able to pass through them. And our plants need water, but they also need nutrients. And also they need a balanced pH so that they can take up the nutrients. And once you add peat into it, it changes that.
Yeah, you do start to mess with it a lot, and I really like the way you pointed out that we're taking something from a totally different ecosystem, a totally different environment, and putting it in our backyard. We do not have peat bogs, here in Hopkinton. Certainly not. And the other piece, to point out is it's just not a sustainable practice. I mean, we're destroying one ecosystem to create another ecosystem, and the harvesting of peat is also just allowing a lot more excess CO2 into the air. So I think it's just important that people know that process is out, and the more you can just kind of leave peat moss and the thought of needing it behind, one, because you're mixing ecosystems and you certainly don't need to do that, and the other because you're harming one ecosystem for the sake of your garden, and that's not fair either. So I definitely hear you on that. So now we're getting to the good part. So now we've got our bed's all prepped, we have our plan, we have our plant list, now we're going shopping, and now we're getting all of our plants. So in the garden guidelines, you mentioned seeding, you mentioned plugs, you mentioned pots, and you mentioned B&B or balled and burlap, so like large shrubs, large trees. What do you prefer? Why? And similar to the solarization, like what are the pros and cons? Like would you choose seed? When would you choose plugs? When would you choose like 1 gallon pots? Balled and burlap is more trees and shrubs, so you can even talk between pots and ball and burlap, but like starting with seed, like when would you want to use seed, and what are the pros and cons of choosing seed?
Seed lives and dies by the seed mix. You've got to know what you need in your garden to start it from seed, and seed is an interesting way of starting. So, for example, many times in a pollinator garden, we're seeding we'll call it a small meadow, and there's a mix that might be successful for your area. You really have to get the right blend of that.
Mm-hmm.
And what's in that mix is going to be a quick annual seed and some perennial seeds.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the things that grow the first year, you're never going to see again, gone. And the rest of them are ultimately there so that the perennials have some time to get rooted and start to materialize.
Mm-hmm.
In those seed mixes are also biennials, things that will last for a short time and then eventually be weeded out or seeded out, if you will, by longer term perennials. It's kind of a succession. So a seed mix is very effective when you have a large space to cover and you can't really get that many plants in there for a meadow look.
Okay.
So a lot of different seeds trying to make their way. Some will be successful, some won't, but there's enough of a mix or diversity that will give your garden a shot at it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, generally with seeds, you have to overseed. You have to seed again. So it's not a one-off. You're not going to get all the benefit in the first time you do it. And the other downside is you've got to look for weeds.
Lots of weeds. You're going to get very good at plant ID.
Yes. And most people are really bad at understanding, is that a weed or is that a real plant? They'll call it a real plant.
Mm-hmm.
Is that should I care about this versus this? How do I know? And a lot of times it's very difficult to ID them. So seed is not my go-to approach if I can avoid it. I love plugs, hard to get them. You have to do that mail order.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're planting a lot of perennials, as an example, and diverse group, but you want starters so they appear like they're going to grow pretty quickly, or at least materialize and get roots established very quickly, you've got a starter set already there at a plug. You've got the root systems begun, and it's ready to start to fill itself out, adapt itself to your soil, and move.
So like a plug is just a very small version of already germinated, a very small version of a plant with a root system that's about, say, 3.5 inches deep. So it's the mini baby version of the plant that you'd ultimately like to grow out.
Right. And often they're more established in the root system than a 1-gallon plant.
Mm-hmm.
Often you'll see something very small in a 1-gallon plant that might have just been potted up.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't always get a full root system in a pot. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But plugs are a great way to go. However, also a challenge depending on the size of the garden. But if you can get even some plugs and you want them to pretty much move quickly, it's a less expensive way to go.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be very effective. But it's hard to find. You've got to look online.
It definitely takes a lot more logistics.
Yes, absolutely.
You can certainly, prior to even working at Weston, I purchased plugs at Native Plant Trust. I purchased plugs at Weston Nurseries, but it's not something that your garden center is going to carry. So you can either find something online and have them sent to you, or you're going to have to go to your garden center with your plant list and ask them to bring those plants in for you. Now, plugs are great because you know exactly what the plant is, the plant looks like, so it makes it a lot easier to weed. It's also important to understand that plugs will dry out quicker.
Yes.
Because they have such a small root system, so they do take, along with the weeding, which is easier, you are going to have to baby them a little bit because they aren't quite established.
That's right. So for a smaller space that you can manage, and if you're doing your garden planning in stages, you can use plugs very effectively. But I find that combining plugs with larger plants, larger container plants,
Mm-hmm.
enables you to kind of manage the budget, as well as make sure that you're getting enough plants in the space quickly to kind of take off.
So how would you suggest doing that hybrid between the 1-gallon pot, say, and the plug? Like, which ones are you going to choose as plugs and which ones would you choose in 1-gallons?
My feeling is if you're bedding out an area, so for example, say we're looking for a shade garden, which is always harder. Always harder. And you need something like a tiarella, and you want that to kind of take over as a ground cover. And you need that to start to keep the weed seeds down, and you want it to lay in among larger, taller growing plants. I would use plugs.
Okay.
It's very effective. Where you want to kind of combine the larger gallon plants is where you need little groupings. I don't need as many of these because plugs usually come in larger quantities as well. You're not buying 5 plugs.
No, they come in trays of 50 and 72. Yeah.
That's right. So you want them to be more of that ground cover or more of that covering a lot of area.
Excellent. Yep.
So the pot plants, fabulous. However, you got to pull them out of the pot sometimes to look at the root system and make sure it's okay.
Okay.
I find that we're not comfortable, especially new gardeners, at hacking roots that are circling around the pot. Oh my God, I'm going to kill the plant.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't do that work, if you don't hack it and open it up and open those roots up, you will have a problem with killing the plant. The plant will girdle itself.
Absolutely, especially when it comes to like woody things like trees and shrubs grown in pots.
Absolutely. So you've got to be able to see that you've got a sustainable root system. It looks good. It's filling the pot a bit. It doesn't have to go all the way to the bottom and circle. You especially in spring, you usually don't get that much of a root system.
No.
So, it's something that looks healthy. The roots are kind of a white color and they're not dark, and you can find them. Those are very important characteristics of selecting plants that will succeed because they're
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. And so you already basically touched on those pots. We touched on pots with the woodies. When would you want to choose just a B&B? When do you want to choose the ball and burlap tree or shrub over something smaller in a pot?
If you have time, your success is going to be using the time to your advantage. You're going to go with a smaller plant or something more in a container. But we live in a world where people don't know how long they're going to be living in a space, or they've lost something and they need some scale in the garden. They don't want just something that looks like a little weed. They need something that has some stature and maybe fits into the existing plant palette. So if you are looking for a tree or a larger statured shrub, balled and burlap is a way to go.
Sure.
Now, what we learn in balled and burlap is that there's a mechanical process of putting that together and balling that whole thing up. And when we plant any of these plants, we have to make sure we're at the right height. And in a balled and burlap, I find that I'm taking 3 to 5 inches off of the top of the ball so that we can plant this at the right height.
So what you're looking for is the flare.
I am looking for the flare, and you don't always see it when you open up that root ball.
No.
And when you pull that burlap back, it looks kind of normal. Yeah, it's a stick in the ground, but there's no flare, and we need that flare to keep that tree or shrub alive. That's how it gets its air circulation. It knows how to move its sugars. It cannot be buried. And so the downside of balled and burlap is either really heavy, and you usually need some machinery or some really strong people to move them, but they also are often planted too deeply, and they'll fail within maybe 3 to 5 years because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. That root flare has to be directly at the surface. Okay, so yeah. I'll just dump into that right now, and then so the root flare, especially when it on a tree, is best to think of it is where the trunk meets the roots, and it kind of skirts out or flares out at the bottom as where the trunk meets the roots. If your tree looks like a lollipop in the landscape and does not flare out at the bottom, then your tree is planted too deeply. You need to see that skirt or that flare at the bottom because, as Cheryl was saying, that is so important to the life cycle of the plant, the way the plant breathes, moves its sugar, moves its nutrients. If you ever see plants, pay attention to plants growing in nature. Trees that naturally grow in places look like they're sitting on top of the soil, and trees planted by landscapers look like they're just buried way down in the soil. It does look like a lollipop stuck in the ground. So that's why we want to have the root flare at the surface, of the soil, and we do not want to ever cover those root flares with mulch. We always want to make sure the mulch is 3-4 inches away. So now I want to move into the part that most people do not think about. Maintaining habitat, because people's idea of a pollinator habitat, a pollinator landscape, stops at planting flowers. Now, why is it so important to maintain, and what is key to maintaining? You spend all this money and all this time trying to draw life to your property, and this is the forgotten part, but I feel like this is the key right here to making sure your pollinator garden is successful. So why is it important to maintain habitat, and what are some of the key things that we need to be doing to make sure that we keep our pollinator habitat thriving?
If you take it from the perspective of the pollinator, you have invited them to set up house on your property. You didn't say that it was a vacation home. You said, I'm willing to invite you and you can live here year round. Well, if your environment does not allow them to set up for year round, they have to move out. And that can be very detrimental to them in their life cycle. So understanding who's living in your yard, knowing a little bit about it, seeing what's being eaten during the season can tell you, I've got some pollinators probably living in perennials that kind of are a little stocky and have some space for them to set up house. Or I've got leaf litter that I've got pollinators nesting in and things happening in that I can't necessarily see, but I'm allowing them to create the house and the environment they need. I've got maybe leaf litter next to trees that have fallen down, and all of a sudden I'm starting to see maybe there's some holes in these trunks or something. What's going on? And then you're also looking at shrubby environments that maybe have no leaves on them anymore, but it looks like something's happening in there. Maybe there's nesting going on.
Mm-hmm.
So what the pollinators are asking you for is leave my environment alone
Mm-hmm.
so that I can stay here and not have to move out and pay rent to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
I'm right happy here. You give me the environment, I'll hang out and I'll come back every year with my family. We'll grow with you.
Mm-hmm.
So you keep it as an environment. You think about it as an environment. How do I live? I live in my house year round. I do different things in the winter than in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily open the windows in the winter. I keep things closed up, so I'm a little bit more hibernated.
Mm-hmm.
So you start to think through, all right, don't take and clean up my entire yard and denude it of all the little micro areas that pollinators have been using and will continue to use.
Like the hollow stems of our perennials and our twigs. Yep.
Also, you may have some host plants, meaning plants that certain pollinators will use for their life cycle from beginning to end. Lay their eggs,
Mm-hmm.
mature, grow up, eat, leave, lay eggs again, whole cycle continues. And it's really important for you to know that that cycle is happening without you watching it all. It's kind of very small. You don't always see
Mm-hmm.
it. And so by disturbing and cleaning everything up so quickly and making everything neat, we are actually destroying all the work that we have now done.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to be happy with messy.
Mm-hmm.
Messy's good. And lazy is good too.
Lazy is certainly good too. I liken the entire process to, I like, as I said before, I love connecting people with, with nature. So we all move into towns, nice towns, safe towns with all the amenities. We got a grocery store there. We got a really good school system. Like, it has everything we need. This is a good place to raise our family. That's exactly what we're doing in our yards. We're creating this nice place. You have the food that you need for your babies. We have the food that you need, for your teenagers and everything, and for the adults. We have all the amenities and everything you need. We have water sources. We have nesting sources. So there's plenty of housing. We want to say to nature, we want to say to our pollinator friends, come here, just live here.
Absolutely.
So we want to bring them in like that. So it's absolutely true. I mean, I also tell people, like, one of the reasons you don't necessarily see lunar moths that often is because we blow every last leaf off of our property, and that's where you find the lunar moth. One of the reasons, people my age who grew up catching fireflies in jars don't see fireflies anymore. Not necessarily a pollinator, but it is a result of our need to clean up in the fall and blow every last leaf off of our property. We're actually taking away from some of the things that we loved as children. And we loved them as children because we didn't maintain the landscape to the extent as we do now, at least when I was younger. I had wild edges on my property, and that's where all the fireflies were, and I'd be out there with a jar in no time. But, it's been, until this past season, it had been 12 to 15 years since I had seen a firefly. So it's just like they're not anywhere around where I've been. So I just kind of, do you have anything else to say to maintenance, and just kind of maintenance tips, or why it's important to, or what to do when you're cutting, like, what do you do in fall? And when do you do things in spring?
I think it's very important for you to stage things. And that's what I mean about lazy.
Mm-hmm.
When we go out to start to clean up in the springtime, we want to do it in a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
Clean it all up, get it all out, pile it all up. And most of us are done by a certain date. We'll
Mm-hmm.
set it in the calendar. Oh, it's got to be done because we're not doing anything anymore. Well, that's not how we like to live as people. That's not how pollinators like to live. They don't all wake up at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
They don't all mature out at the same time. Our weather, by the way, and temperatures also impact that when my wake up call is. So by taking your time in cleaning up in stages and a little at a time, not cutting all the perennials back at the same day, the pollinators might be there. Be observant. Do you
Mm-hmm.
see any activity? What's really going on? Is it really quiet? Might want to leave some of them alone. So take it easy, slow, and make sure you're not doing it too early. Like if the soil is wet in your yard, you shouldn't be walking on it. It's a bad
Mm-hmm.
idea. You're going to compact the soil, create other problems. So wait for it to dry out a bit. If the temperature doesn't get above 50 or more, you probably don't want to be out there cutting things back. Yes, it might be convenient to your schedule, but it's not convenient to your garden. So that's where the lazy part comes in. Take your time, stage it, move it over weeks, not days.
Which
And I,
isn't a bad thing. That way you don't have to cancel all your plans for the weekend to do your spring cleanup. And definitely would urge people to leave the leaves and leave all your perennials standing, because that's key for the next generation of all the pollinators that you spent that year attracting.
there's one other thing that's very important about leaving the leaves. So we leave the leaves and then we get messiness issues, right? Oh my God, my garden's messy. My neighbor's all cleaned up. Mine looks terrible. I have to rake all the leaves up. Not a good idea. Layers come off. And before you actually go to composting or mowing them, dry them out. Let the pollinators move out of the zone. Don't tell them you're evicted now and I'm killing you on the way. No, time it slowly. So take a layer off, let them dry out, compost them. Take a layer off, let them dry out, compost.
Yeah, otherwise you're just going to run your mower all over those cocoons that you were spending so much time for. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it can sound like it's so high maintenance and so hard, but as you said, it really is just lazy gardening. And to me, I've just always found it fascinating that, connecting the practices and saying, because people would say, just rake out your beds in November and then mow it and I'll blow them back in. Well, that is one way to do it, but you may have just chopped up all the cocoons like we were talking about, or you may have just disturbed, that queen bumblebee who was just trying to hunker down, and we all know that on a cold evening, once we get all snug, we don't want to get out from under the covers. So just let everybody be and wait until spring for sure.
Yeah. And, we've just talked about things in a lot more depth because as you get into gardening, you want to know more. And so we've given you a little bit more. But the most important piece is, and the reason why the manual was structured the way it was, step by step, is that it's not overwhelming. You take small pieces at a time. You do a little bit and experiment. You see where you're successful and you love it. You enjoy it. It drags you in to do more. And it's that dedication to the learning, to the observing, to the being outside, to the seeing things you've never seen in your life happen because you're looking in the garden. There's so much activity that we don't pay attention to. And yet when we sit out there and just observe, all of this life is around us. It's so exciting.
And we're reminded again that we are a part of nature and just not apart from. Nature's always out there. It's out, and then we're kind of reminded when we interact with our gardens that it's a part of us. Nature, we are a part of nature and nature is a part of us. So I think that's very important. Just kind of as we come to the end of the episode, one of the questions that I plan to ask everybody is just that one actionable item. So like if somebody either starting right now, in early spring, what is the thing you can do, or come spring, let's just say it's now, April. What is one actionable item that the listeners can start either today or this season, if they only do one thing, that will make their yards more pollinator friendly?
I think it's most important to be out and observe, notice what's happening. Like what's attracting pollinators today? What do you have growing today that you've got some activity? Because if you've got some activity there, you might be able to expand that activity nearby. Because pollinators are not able to travel long distances to get their food and to get their shelter. So if you want them to camp with you, kind of create a little bit more room for them to hang out longer. So just notice what's happening there first and be sure that you let it happen. Don't cut it all back and prune it all out and do all that stuff. So small steps, observe first. It's the first thing we do when we start to understand our conditions. We have to collect some data. So collect some data.
That is excellent advice, and I'm glad that you brought it all the way back to the beginning. That was perfect. So I just want to thank you so much for all of your wisdom. I want to thank you so much for your work on the Pollinator Manual, which can be found at the Native Plant Trust website. So definitely check it out there. Can you please tell our listeners how they can find out more about you, how they can find you, if they have any questions for you or whatever, how can they find more about you and everything that you're about?
I have a website called dancingshadows.com. nativeplantsdesign.com. And if
Okay.
you ever have to reach me, I have a way for you just to send me a note and then I'll respond back. I like to hear from people, see what they're thinking, what questions they have. But it's really easy to find me. I keep it very simple online, very, very tight, because my belief is to create relationships with people. And so we expand from that initial engagement.
So that is awesome, and I will definitely encourage people to keep their eyes out at Native Plant Trust, Coastal Maine, Botanic Gardens, Tower Hill, looking out for your name and for classes that you may be doing in person or that you may be doing, online, so people can just check out and learn so much more from you. I thank you so much for joining us today, and just like I said, everything that you shared, your perspective was great, so thank you so much, Cheryl, for being on today.
You're welcome, Trevor.
I thank you for joining Peace, Love, and Pollinators, and we'll see you next time. Take care.